Hospitals are never truly quiet. Even during the dead of night, when the hallways are nearly empty, there's always a hum of activity somewhere. Machines beeping, distant voices, the occasional hurried footsteps echoing down sterile corridors. I had worked the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital for almost 2 years. It was an old building, with parts of it dating back to the early 1900s. While the main floors had been renovated over the years, the underground tunnels remained untouched. A labyrinth of dimly lit hallways used for transporting supplies, laundry, and sometimes even bodies to the morgue. Most employees hated going down there. I never blamed them. Something about those tunnels felt wrong. And one night, I found out why. It was just after 2 a.m., and I was the only orderly on shift that night. The hospital was short-staffed, as usual, and I had been tasked with transferring a patient's body to the morgue. It was a routine job. I had done it dozens of times before. The drill was simple. Take the stretcher, roll it into the service elevator, wheel it down the tunnel, drop it off at the morgue, and return. 10 minutes, max. But as soon as the elevator doors slid open to the basement, I felt it. That heavy, pressing silence. Like the air was thicker down here. I swallowed hard and stepped out, the wheels of the stretcher squeaking against the cold concrete floor. The hallway stretched ahead, long and dimly lit, the flickering overhead lights barely illuminating the path. Something about the tunnel always made it feel endless, like it stretched farther than it should. That night, it felt worse. I started walking, keeping my head down and my pace quick. The morgue was at the far end of the tunnel, past the old supply rooms that nobody really used anymore. As I moved past one of them, I heard it, a soft, shuffling noise behind me. I froze. I turned my head slightly, my breath catching in my throat. The hallway behind me was empty. I exhaled, shaking my head. It's just my mind playing tricks on me. I kept walking, but then, the shuffling came again. Closer. A chill ran down my spine. I gripped the stretcher tighter, my fingers going numb. I was alone down here. The only people who ever came down to this part of the hospital were orderlies, and I was the only one working tonight. I turned fully, my pulse pounding in my ears. The hallway was still empty, but something felt off. It was too quiet, too still, like something was waiting, watching. I turned back toward the morgue and walked faster. The wheels of the stretcher rattled against the uneven floor, the sound bouncing off the tunnel walls. With every step, I felt it more, that horrible, crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like something was right behind me. But I refused to look. I focused on the double doors of the morgue just ahead. Almost there. Then, the overhead lights flickered, and the stretcher suddenly stopped moving. I stumbled forward, barely catching myself. I turned, expecting to see that a wheel had gotten stuck on something, but my breath hitched, because the stretcher wasn't stuck on anything. It was being held. My hands trembled as I gripped the metal bars, trying to push forward. The wheels refused to budge. It felt like someone was gripping the other side, holding it in place. I sucked in a shaky breath. No, this isn't real. I yanked the stretcher hard, and suddenly, it lurched forward on its own, nearly knocking me off balance. The hallway behind me was still empty, but now, the air was freezing. I didn't hesitate. I bolted through the morgue doors, wheeling the stretcher inside, and slammed them shut. Inside, the morgue was even colder than usual. The overhead light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the metal storage units lining the walls. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I just needed to get this over with and leave. I rolled the stretcher toward an empty storage unit, unlocked it, and grabbed the handle. When I saw it, the body's hand, peeking from under the sheet. That wasn't unusual, but the fingers were wrong. They were curled slightly, as if gripping something, like they had been holding onto the stretcher. A violent shudder ran through me. I yanked the sheet back slightly, just enough to see the patient's face, and my stomach dropped. The eyes were open, staring straight at me. I stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear. I knew the patient was dead. He had been pronounced hours ago, but his expression was twisted, mouth slightly open, eyes wide with something that looked like fear, like he had seen something before he died. Then, a knock. It came from the morgue doors. Soft, slow, Not rushed, not urgent, just deliberate. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was on the other side. But the knocking continued, closer this time, like someone was pressing against the door. Then, it stopped. The room fell into dead silence. I slowly turned toward the doors and saw the faintest outline of a shadow underneath. It stood there for a long moment. Then, it moved away. I didn't wait. I shoved the body into the storage unit, slammed it shut, and bolted from the room. The hallway outside was empty, but I didn't care. I ran. All the way to the elevator, up to the main floor, and straight to the security office. I told them everything. They checked the cameras, and what they saw made my blood run cold. Because for the entire duration of my time in the morgue, the doors had never been touched. No one had been there. No one. But me. I quit the night shift 2 weeks later. I never set foot in that basement again, and I never, ever walked those tunnels alone. Working the night shift at a care home wasn't supposed to be terrifying. I had taken the job because I liked helping people. The elderly residents, for the most part, were sweet, appreciative, and just happy to have someone to talk to. My job was simple: make my rounds, check vitals, respond to any emergencies, and ensure that the residents were safe and comfortable while they slept. But on quiet nights, when the hallways were empty and the world outside felt far away, the care home took on a different atmosphere. A place filled with memories, lost stories, and lingering whispers of the past. And something else. Something that watched from the shadows. I had been working at Evergreen Assisted Living for about 6 months when I first noticed it. It was a particularly slow night. Only a handful of residents were awake, a few buzzing for water or help getting comfortable. By 3 a.m., most of them were asleep. I was making my final rounds, walking down the long hallway that stretched past the empty rooms reserved for new residents. Those rooms always made me feel uneasy. The lights inside were off, but the doors were always left slightly open, just enough to see the empty beds inside. I hurried past them, making my way toward Mrs. Holloway's room. She was one of our oldest residents, 98 years old and still sharp as ever. But she had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night, convinced someone had been in her room. She wasn't the only one. I knocked lightly on her door before stepping in. She was sitting upright in bed, her frail hands gripping the blanket tightly. Her eyes flickered toward me, filled with something that almost looked like relief. "You saw it too, didn't you?" she whispered. I frowned, stepping closer. "Saw what?" She hesitated, glancing toward the darkened corner of the room, near the closet. "The man," she whispered. "The one who stands there at night." I felt a small chill creep down my spine. This wasn't the first time she had said something like this. "Mrs. Holloway," I said gently, "no one else is here. I just checked the hallway. The doors are locked." She stared at me, her pale blue eyes unblinking. "They don't use doors," she murmured. A silence stretched between us, a strange, heavy silence that made the room feel colder. I turned slightly, glancing at the closet. It was closed, but the feeling in the room was off, like something had been here and had just left. After a few minutes, I managed to calm her down, reassuring her that everything was fine. She lay back against her pillows, but before I left, she whispered one last thing. "Don't turn your back to the hall." I forced a small laugh. "Why's that?" She didn't blink. "Because that's when they move." I walked out of her room, shaking off the unease curling in my stomach. I had heard strange things before. Residents talking to people who weren't there, complaining about cold spots, seeing shadows move in empty doorways. It was easy to dismiss it, until I reached the end of the hallway, and saw it for myself. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A dark figure, standing at the far end of the hall, near the empty rooms. It was tall, its body blending into the shadows. I blinked, and for a split second, it moved. A jerky, unnatural shift. Not like someone walking, but like something being pulled. I sucked in a sharp breath, my heart slamming against my ribs. No, it's a trick of the light. I took a step forward, my fingers tightening around the notepad in my hand. And then, the hallway light above me flickered. and the figure was suddenly closer. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I turned on my heel and walked as quickly as I could back to the nurse's station. I refused to run, refused to let whatever it was know that I had seen it. By the time I reached the brightly lit station, my hands were shaking. I sat down, trying to steady my breath, and then my radio crackled. I nearly jumped out of my chair. The voice on the other end was David, the security guard. "You okay?" he asked. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to sound normal. "Yeah, why?" There was a pause. Then, in a tone that sent ice through my veins, he said, "Because I just saw someone standing in the hallway behind you." I whipped around so fast my chair nearly tipped over. Nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching into darkness. But the feeling was still there. The heavy, pressing presence. Watching, waiting. I stayed behind the desk for the rest of my shift, unwilling to step into the halls alone. When morning finally came and the day shift arrived, I grabbed my bag and left without looking back. As I stepped outside into the rising sun, I felt the tension in my chest finally release. But just as I reached my car, my phone buzzed with a message from David. It was a security screenshot from the hallway camera. A grainy, low-quality image showing me standing at the nurse's station, and directly behind me, a tall, shadowy figure standing just inches away. Too close, too real, and its head was tilted toward me, like it was whispering something. I quit 2 weeks later. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know if it was real, or if the stories from the residents had finally gotten to me. But sometimes, late at night, I still feel it. That cold, heavy sensation on the back of my neck. Like something is still there. Like something is still watching. And every time I pass an open doorway, I resist the urge to glance inside. Because deep down I know, if I look too long, I might see it again. Working night security at a museum sounds peaceful. That's what I told myself when I first took the job. I imagined quiet hallways, long hours spent reading or listening to music, and the occasional half-hearted patrol around the exhibits. I never expected the unease that would settle into my bones every time I stepped into that building after dark. There's something unsettling about a place meant for crowds being completely empty. The exhibits stand frozen in time, waiting for visitors who won't come until morning. But at night, when the lights are dim and the silence stretches too long, it feels like something else is waiting too. And one night, I learned that I wasn't alone. I had been working at the Carver History Museum for about 4 months when it happened. It was a slow night, like most. My partner, Greg, had called in sick, so I was working alone. That didn't bother me much. I liked the quiet. My shift started at 11 p.m., and for the first few hours, everything was normal. I did my usual rounds, checking the ancient artifacts, the dioramas, and the massive dinosaur skeleton in the main hall. By 2 a.m., I was back at the security office, watching the grainy black and white feeds from the cameras. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still in the Egyptian exhibit. My stomach dropped. The Egyptian exhibit was on the second floor, a dimly lit room filled with ancient artifacts, including a sarcophagus and several well-preserved mummies. I leaned forward, my breath hitching. The figure stood just outside the sarcophagus display, facing the camera. It wasn't moving. It wasn't supposed to be there. At first, I thought it was a mannequin. Some of the exhibits had life-sized figures dressed in historical clothing, meant to recreate scenes from the past. But there was no mannequin in that section of the museum. I would know. I had checked the exhibit myself earlier that night. So then, who was that? I swallowed hard and grabbed my flashlight. It's probably nothing. Maybe a shadow. Maybe a trick of the cameras. I just needed to go up there, take a quick look, and put my mind at ease. I stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing too loudly against the marble floors. Every instinct in my body told me not to go, but I had to. I had to know. The museum was dead silent as I climbed the stairs to the second floor. The Egyptian exhibit was at the end of the hallway, its entrance marked by 2 massive stone pillars. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. The air felt thick, almost heavy, like walking through water. I flicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the darkened room. The sarcophagus stood in the center, surrounded by ancient artifacts sealed behind glass cases. The walls were lined with hieroglyphics, their carved figures staring blankly into the dim light. But there was no one there. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to relax. Maybe the camera had glitched. Maybe I had imagined it. I turned to leave, and then, from somewhere behind me, a soft rustling sound. I froze. The hair on my arms stood on end. It wasn't the air vents. It wasn't my own movements. It was something else. Something in the room with me. I slowly turned, my flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. And then I saw it. The sarcophagus lid. It was open. I couldn't breathe. I had been the last person in this room. The sarcophagus had been closed during my last round. I would have noticed if it had been open. And yet, the lid was now slightly ajar, revealing just a sliver of darkness inside. Like something had crawled out. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I took a cautious step forward, shining my flashlight directly at the sarcophagus. There was nothing inside, just an empty void of blackness. The rustling sound came again, this time, from the far side of the room. I whipped my light toward the display case near the mummy exhibit, and for a split second, I saw something move. A shadow, darting too fast across the glass. I spun, my heart slamming in my chest, scanning the room, but I was alone. No one was there, just the still figures in the hieroglyphics, watching me from the walls, and the empty sarcophagus, waiting. I backed away slowly, my breath shallow. I didn't care what was happening. I just knew I needed to get out of that room. I reached the exit, my skin crawling, and just as I stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered, and from inside the exhibit, I heard it, a slow, rasping breath. I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted. I ran all the way back to the security office, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I turned to the cameras, my hands shaking, but the figure was gone. The sarcophagus lid was closed again, like it had never been open at all. The rest of the night, I didn't leave the office. I watched the cameras, waiting, dreading, for something to happen, but nothing did. The museum stayed silent, empty, like it had been all in my head. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, I told them what happened. The curator, an older man who had worked there for over 20 years, listened without interrupting. When I finished, he only nodded, like he wasn't surprised. Then, he said something that made my blood run cold. "You're not the first one to see it," he murmured, "and you won't be the last." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the Egyptian exhibit, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "things that have been buried too long don't like being disturbed." I quit 2 weeks later. I never went back. And to this day, I wonder, if I had stayed in that room a little longer, if I had stepped closer to that sarcophagus, would I have seen what came out? Or worse, would it have seen me? Working nights at a small-town pub wasn't exactly glamorous, but it paid the bills. I had been bartending at McCready's pub for about a year, and by then, I knew all the regulars, the usual troublemakers, in which customers not to cut off too early unless I wanted a headache. It was a cozy place, a little worn down, with old wooden floors that creaked when you walked too fast and a mirror behind the bar that had probably been there since the 1940s. It was the kind of bar where people told stories. Ghost stories, mostly. I never took them seriously. At least, not until I saw him. It started on a slow Thursday night. The rush had come and gone, leaving just me, one last drunk at the corner booth, and my coworker Eddie, who was wiping down the tables and grumbling about how bad the tips had been. I was stacking glasses behind the bar when I saw it, a figure moving in the reflection of the bar mirror. I looked up, expecting to see Eddie behind me, but he was still at the booth, far across the room. The figure, however, hadn't disappeared. It stood near the end of the bar, a tall, shadowy silhouette, unmoving. I turned around fast. No one was there. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow from the neon beer signs flickering against the glass. But something about it bothered me. I could have sworn it had been watching me. I shook off the feeling and got back to work. Eddie tossed his rag onto the bar and sighed. I'm heading to the back to grab some more paper towels. You good? I nodded. Yeah, just gonna finish closing up. He disappeared into the storage room, leaving me alone in the bar. For a few minutes, everything was fine. Then, the beer tap turned on by itself. I watched, frozen, as amber liquid spilled over the rim of the glass and onto the counter. I hadn't touched it. I rushed forward, quickly shutting it off, my heart hammering. It had to be a pressure issue, right? A malfunction? But as I grabbed a towel to clean up the mess, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The beer tap handle was tilted downward, like someone had pulled it. I stepped back, my breath unsteady. The bar was silent, but the air felt wrong. Heavy, thick, like something was still here. I slowly turned my head, my eyes drifting toward the bar mirror. And there he was. This time, I saw him clearly. A man in old-fashioned clothes, standing at the far end of the bar, his head slightly tilted. He was dressed like a bartender from the 1920s, with suspenders and a white button-down, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows. His face was pale, almost grayish, and he was staring right at me. I spun around, my stomach twisting into knots. The spot where he had been standing was empty. I whipped back to the mirror. He was still there, but this time, he was closer. I stumbled backward, knocking into a stack of glasses. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the empty bar. And just like that, the figure vanished. Eddie came bursting out of the back room, looking half asleep but concerned. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, looking at the broken glasses. I opened my mouth to tell him, to say, "I think I just saw a ghost." But before I could, he frowned, then said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You look like you just saw him." I stared at him. "Him?" Eddie sighed, grabbing a broom. "Yeah, the bartender." I didn't move. "What bartender?" Eddie gave me a strange look. "The one who died here." I felt my stomach drop. Eddie continued, talking as he swept up the broken glass. "Back in the 30s, a bartender got shot right where you're standing. Some guy accused him of cheating at cards, came in after hours, and put a bullet in his chest." My pulse pounded in my ears. People say he never left. I swallowed hard. I wanted to believe Eddie was just messing with me, but the way he said it, so casually, like it was common knowledge, made my skin crawl. And then he added, "Weird stuff happens here all the time. Beer taps turning on, glasses moving, lights flickering." I thought about the tap that had turned on by itself. My hands clenched into fists. "You could have warned me." Eddie chuckled. "Would you have believed me?" I didn't answer. But that night, as I finished closing up, I caught one last glimpse of the mirror. And for a split second, I swear I saw him standing behind me again. This time, he wasn't staring. This time, he was smiling, like he was enjoying the show. I quit a few months later, but I never forgot that night. Some ghosts linger because they have unfinished business, but others, they stay because they like to watch. Working overnight at a homeless shelter wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. Most nights were quiet, occasional arguments, some restless guests, but nothing out of the ordinary. I had taken the job because I wanted to help. I believed that people, no matter how lost or broken, deserved kindness. But there was something about the shelter at night. When the hallways were empty, the lights buzzed softly, and the only sounds were the occasional murmurs from sleeping guests. It didn't feel like a place of refuge. It felt like something else was lurking there, unseen. And one night, I learned the hard way that some doors should never be opened. The shelter was an old brick building, formerly a hospital in the 1950s. It had been renovated decades ago, but the bones of the old building remained. Long, narrow hallways, rooms that felt too cold, even in the summer. A basement that staff avoided unless absolutely necessary. That night, I was working alone. It wasn't uncommon. We were understaffed, and budget cuts meant I had to cover the desk and patrol the halls myself. 3 a.m. was always the quietest hour. Or at least, it was supposed to be. I was finishing up paperwork at the front desk, listening to the soft hum of the security monitors, when I heard it, a footstep in the hallway behind me. I stiffened. Most of the guests were asleep by now. Anyone wandering around at this hour was either lost or looking for trouble. I stood up and called out, "Hey, you need help?" No answer, just silence. I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the hallway, the worn linoleum creaking beneath my shoes. The lights above flickered faintly. I swept my flashlight from side to side, scanning the hall. No one, just closed doors, numbered with peeling gold plaques. But as I turned to go back, one door at the end of the hallway was slightly open, room 211. I knew for a fact that no one was assigned to that room. A deep, unsettling chill crawled up my spine. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, to walk away, but I needed to be sure. If a guest had wandered in, they weren't supposed to be there. If someone had broken in, I needed to know. I stepped forward, pushing the door open wider. The room inside was pitch black. I shined my flashlight and froze. The room wasn't empty. The bed had been stripped down to the mattress, but there were footprints in the dust-covered floor. Bare footprints, leading from the closet to the door. To me, I felt a sharp chill crawl up my spine. I took a step back, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Then, from inside the closet, a rustling sound. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the door shut, twisting the rusty lock until it clicked. Then I stepped back, waiting, listening. My fingers trembled around my flashlight as I held my breath. 1 second passed. 2. Then, from behind the door, a faint knock. I turned and bolted back down the hallway, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the front desk, my breath coming in sharp gasps. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the radio and called security. By the time the on-call officer arrived, the hallway was quiet again. I led him to room 211, my stomach twisting in knots. I expected the door to still be locked, but when we got there, it was open, wider than before. The officer stepped inside first, sweeping the room with his flashlight. Nothing, just an empty bed and an old wooden closet. He pulled the door open, and inside, the dust was undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my chest. I knew what I had seen. The footprints, the knocking. Someone had been in that room. Someone had walked toward me, but there was no one here. The officer turned to me. "You sure you saw something?" I nodded, but my throat was dry. "Yeah." He shrugged. "Weird place. These old buildings, they have history." I barely slept the next morning, but I did my research, and I wish I hadn't, because 10 years ago, room 211 belonged to a man named David Harper, a former resident who had disappeared one night without a trace. Security footage showed him walking into his room, but never coming out. The cameras never caught him leaving. It was as if he had simply vanished. That was the last night I worked alone, and I never opened that door again. But sometimes, when I passed by room 211, I swear, I could hear it. That faint, deliberate knock, waiting for someone to answer. The worst part about working the night shift at a gas station isn't the boredom. It isn't the drunks, the sketchy customers, or the occasional shoplifters. It's the isolation. Standing behind the counter at 3 a.m., with nothing but the hum of the refrigerators and the flickering neon sign outside. You start to feel like you're the only person left in the world. At least, that's how it felt, until the night I met her. And then, I wished I was alone. It was a quiet Tuesday night. The gas station I worked at was just off the highway, the last stop for miles before the road disappeared into empty farmland. We never got many customers at this hour, just the occasional trucker stopping for coffee, or a tired traveler filling up their tank. But that night, I was alone, until the old woman arrived. I noticed her as soon as she stepped inside. She moved slowly, her small frame draped in a tattered gray shawl. Her hair was thin and white, pulled into a loose bun at the nape of her neck. She had no car, no purse, just herself, and something about her felt wrong. She shuffled toward the counter, her eyes locked on me. At first, I gave her the usual greeting. "Evening, ma'am. Can I help you find something?" She didn't answer. She just stared at me. Up close, she looked worse. Her skin was pale and sunken, her lips cracked. Her eyes were the worst part. Not cloudy like you'd expect from someone her age, but dark and too wide, like she was trying to see something just beyond me. She finally spoke, but her voice was too soft, too dry. "Where's Henry?" I hesitated. I don't know anyone named Henry. Do you need help?" Her mouth twitched. Then, too fast, she lifted a bony hand and pointed toward the glass doors. "He's waiting outside," she whispered. I turned. The parking lot was empty. I forced a polite smile. "Ma'am, I think you might be confused. No one's out there." She didn't react. She just kept pointing, her hand shaking slightly. Then, in that same dry whisper, she said, "You shouldn't keep him waiting." A cold prickle of unease crawled up my spine. I glanced at the security monitors, half expecting to see someone standing outside. Nothing. Just the gas pumps and the empty road beyond them. I turned back to her, my voice a little unsteady now. "Maybe you should sit down? I can call someone for you." She didn't blink. Then, without moving her lips, she whispered, "He's getting impatient." I felt my stomach drop. I hadn't imagined it. Her mouth never moved, but I heard her voice. I heard it, a dry, rasping whisper, inside my head. I took a step back, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "Ma'am," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice calm, "who exactly are you waiting for?" She lowered her hand, folding it neatly over the other. For the first time, she smiled, and it was wrong. "Henry," she repeated softly. Then, she leaned forward, just enough for me to smell the faint, rotting scent clinging to her clothes. "He's waiting in the last stall." I felt my blood run cold. The last stall. She meant the bathroom outside. A single, graffiti-covered stall just behind the station, used mostly by truckers. It was dark and locked. No one had used it all night. I knew that for a fact. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "Ma'am, I really think you should sit down." But she was already turning away. Her footsteps made no sound as she shuffled toward the glass doors. Then, right before she stepped outside, she stopped, and without looking back, she whispered, "He's knocking." Bang! The sound slammed through the station, shaking the glass doors. A single, heavy knock, echoing from behind the building. From the bathroom stall. I jumped, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to the security cameras, flipping through the angles, and when I got to the backlot feed, I felt my breath catch. The bathroom stall door was open, just slightly, like someone had pushed it from the inside. But I knew, it had been locked. No one had gone back there. No one, except maybe Henry. I grabbed the store phone with shaking hands, dialing 911. The dispatcher picked up immediately. 911. "What's your emergency?" I hesitated. What was I supposed to say? That an old woman appeared out of nowhere, talked about a man in the bathroom, and then something started knocking? I forced myself to breathe. "There's someone in the back lot," I said quickly. "I think someone might be in trouble." I didn't mention Henry. I didn't mention the old woman, because somehow I knew they wouldn't find her. The police arrived within minutes. I met them outside, my breath visible in the cold air. They checked the bathroom stall first. I stood back, arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching as one officer pushed the door open wider. Then, he froze, and slowly, he stepped inside. I felt the tension in the air shift. Then, he called for his partner. And I knew before they even spoke, because from where I was standing, I could already see it. The faded writing on the back wall of the stall, carved deep into the old, peeling paint. One word, Henry. I don't know what they found inside. They never told me. But that was the last night I ever worked alone. And I never went near that bathroom again. Because sometimes, when I passed by it on my way to my car, I thought I heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking. Soft, patient, waiting. Working the night shift at a fast food restaurant was supposed to be boring. A few late-night stragglers, maybe some drunken customers, and a lot of cleaning. That was how I expected my shifts to go. But this place was different. And I found out why on a cold February night, alone in a nearly empty store, when something in the shadows started knocking. I worked at a 24-hour burger joint just off the highway, the kind of place truckers and night owls pass through before heading back onto the road. Most nights were slow. Between 2 and 4 a.m., we rarely got more than 1 or 2 customers. It was the dead zone, and that was when the weird stuff happened. I had heard stories from my coworkers before, how the fryers would turn on by themselves. How, sometimes, when people worked alone, they'd hear someone whispering their name. I laughed it off at first, until it happened to me. It was a Thursday night, just past 3 a.m. The dining area was empty. No customers, no deliveries, just me. I had already wiped down the counters, taken out the trash, and restocked the condiments. Everything was done, so I stood behind the register, scrolling through my phone, waiting for the next wave of nothing. Then, a soft knock. I froze. The sound had come from the drive-thru speaker. I looked up at the screen, expecting to see a car waiting for their order. Nothing. The lane was completely empty. I leaned toward the microphone, pressing the button. Hello? Silence. Then, another knock. I stepped closer to the window, peering out into the empty drive-thru. The security lights cast long, stretched-out shadows, but there were no headlights, no car, no sign that anyone had been there. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. I told myself it was just the wind. That's what I wanted to believe. Until I heard the footsteps. They were inside the building. A slow, deliberate shuffle, coming from the kitchen behind me. I turned quickly, heart pounding. "Eddie?" I called out, even though I knew I was alone. No response. The kitchen was dark, except for the dull glow of the heat lamps. The fryers were off. The grills had been cleaned. But something felt wrong. Like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like someone else was. I walked slowly toward the back of the kitchen, my shoes squeaking against the tile. The air was thick, like the lingering grease had solidified into something heavier. That's when I saw it. The freezer door. It was open, just slightly, like someone had just stepped inside. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I had to check. I had to know. I reached out, grabbing the metal handle. It was ice cold under my fingers. I pulled the door open, and for a second, I saw something move. It was fast, a dark shape that darted into the corner of the freezer, slipping behind the stacked boxes of frozen fries. My breath caught. I stepped forward, my hand hovering over my radio. I wasn't about to be the guy who called my manager at 3 a.m. saying, "Hey, I think we have a ghost in the freezer," but something was in there with me. I could feel it. I hesitated, then reached for the light switch. The freezer buzzed to life under the dim fluorescent glow, the boxes casting long, uneven shadows. I waited. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The cold air pressed against my skin, numbing my fingertips. I took one more step forward, and that's when the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my breath fogging in the air. I grabbed the handle, yanking hard. It wouldn't budge. Panic started to creep in. "Hello?" I called, banging on the door. "Is someone out there?" Silence. Then, from behind me, a single, sharp breath. I turned slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. And there, standing in the corner of the freezer, was a man, or what was left of him. His skin was pale, frostbitten, his lips cracked and blue. His uniform was identical to mine, but older, faded, like it had been left in the cold for decades. His eyes were wide and empty, fixed on me, and then he smiled. I threw myself at the door, pounding against the metal. "Let me out!" I screamed. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, mixing with the freezing air. Behind me, the figure took a step forward. The freezer got colder. I felt my skin tighten, my lips go numb. Then, the door swung open. I stumbled out, collapsing onto the tile floor. The moment I hit the ground, I turned. The freezer was empty. The figure was gone. The only thing left was a single, frost-covered name tag, lying just inside the door. I picked it up with shaking hands, brushing the frost away. And when I saw the name, I felt my stomach drop, because it was the name of an employee who had died here years ago. A worker who had gotten locked in the freezer one night, and never made it out. I quit the next day. I never went back. But sometimes, when I drive past that restaurant at night, I see it. The faint, flickering glow of the freezer light. And for a split second, I swear I see a shadow, standing just inside the door, watching, waiting. I always thought working the night shift at a movie theater would be easy. No customers, no screaming kids, just a quiet building and a list of closing duties. I had no idea that theaters, when they're empty, don't feel empty at all. And one night, I learned that some seats never stay vacant for long. The theater I worked at was old. One of those classic places with red velvet seats, gold-painted molding, and massive chandeliers that flickered no matter how many times maintenance checked the wiring. Most nights were uneventful. The last show usually ended around 11:30 p.m., and by midnight, the lobby was empty. The cleanup crew would do their rounds, then leave me and Mark, the other night manager, to lock up. But on this night, Mark had called in sick, and I was alone. By 12:45 a.m., I had finished most of my duties. The lobby was spotless, the registers were counted, and the security cameras showed nothing but empty hallways and darkened screens. All I had left to do was my final walkthrough, checking each auditorium to make sure no one had fallen asleep during the last movie. I wasn't worried. This place had been cleared an hour ago, but as I stepped into Theater 6, something felt off. The air was heavier in this room, the kind of heavy that presses against your skin, makes you second-guess yourself. I flicked on my flashlight and swept it over the seats. Rows of emptiness stretched before me, the massive screen looming like a sleeping giant. Just as I turned to leave, I saw it, a single person, sitting in the back row. I froze. I knew for a fact that no one should be in here. The last movie had ended over an hour ago, and the usher who cleaned this auditorium had reported it empty. But someone was sitting there, motionless, watching me. I cleared my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Hey there," I called, taking a step closer. "Movie's over. We're closing up." They didn't respond. They just sat there, silent and still, their face obscured by the shadows. I took another step forward, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. The theater had been warm all night, but now I could see my breath fogging in front of me. I reached for my radio. "Hey, Tony," I said, calling the security guard. "You still here?" Silence. Then, the person in the seat tilted their head. My stomach dropped. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but something about it felt unnatural, like they were acknowledging me, like they were listening. I gripped my flashlight tighter. "Sir?" I tried again. "We're closed. You can't be in here." Still, no response. I took one more step, and suddenly, the entire screen flickered to life. Static. Bright, flickering static that shouldn't have been possible. The projector was off. I had checked it myself. My breath hitched. I turned back to the seat in the last row, but it was empty. I swallowed hard. I knew what I had seen. Someone had been sitting there. I hadn't imagined it. The theater was empty now, but the air still felt thick, charged, like something had just moved through it. I backed toward the exit, keeping my flashlight up. Then, a loud thump. It came from the projection room upstairs. A heavy, deliberate sound, like something had just fallen or been thrown. My heart slammed against my ribs. No one was up there. There was no reason for that noise. I stared up at the small window where the projector should have been dark, and felt my blood run cold, because there was a face staring back at me. I bolted. I ran out of the auditorium, straight into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. I grabbed my radio again, my fingers trembling. "Tony, where the hell are you?" Silence. Then, finally, static. And beneath the static, a voice. Too faint, too distorted. But I knew what it said. "Why did you leave?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. I ran straight to the security office, shoving open the door, only to find Tony's radio sitting on the desk. But Tony? Nowhere to be found. I quit 2 weeks later. But before I left, I asked one of the older employees about Theater 6. They gave me a strange look. Then they sighed. "Yeah, they muttered. You saw him. I felt my skin crawl. Who? The employee hesitated. Then, finally, the guy who never leaves. To this day, I don't know who or what I saw in that theater. But sometimes, when I drive past the building at night, I see it. A single light flickering in Theater 6. And I wonder, if I had stayed a little longer, would I have seen what he was waiting for? Night security at a warehouse sounded easy. No customers, no stressful interactions, just hours of quiet, walking the same routes over and over again. That's what I thought when I took the job. But I had no idea that some places were never meant to be empty. And I never expected to find out what lurked there when no one else was watching. The warehouse was massive. 3 floors, rows upon rows of tall metal shelves, and a storage section that stretched so far back, the lights barely reached the end. During the day, it was bustling with workers, forklifts beeping, conveyor belts humming. But at night, it was silent. Too silent. I was the only one on shift that night. The last employees had left by 11 p.m., and by midnight, I was alone. I had my usual routine: walk the perimeter, check the camera feeds, make sure no one had broken in. Simple. At least, it should have been. Around 2 a.m., I was in the security office, watching the monitors. Nothing but rows of empty shelves and darkened hallways. Then, on camera 6, I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of aisle 17. I frowned. There wasn't supposed to be anyone here. I leaned closer, adjusting the angle. The figure stood perfectly still, barely visible in the dim lighting. It looked like a man, but something was off. His head was tilted too far to one side, and his arms hung unnaturally at his sides. I reached for my radio, even though I knew I was the only one on duty. "Hello?" I said, half expecting static. Instead, the figure moved. Not like a person, not like someone walking, but like something being pulled. 1 second, he was at the end of the aisle, and in the blink of an eye, he was closer. Halfway down the aisle now, still staring at the camera, still tilted, wrong. A sharp chill crawled down my spine. I flipped through the other cameras. The figure wasn't on any of them. I turned back to camera 6, and my breath caught in my throat. He was even closer now, just at the edge of the camera's view. Still motionless, still watching. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight and left the office, my footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. I didn't believe in ghosts. I didn't believe in monsters. But something deep inside me whispered, "You shouldn't be doing this." I ignored it, and I kept walking. The warehouse was cold at night. The air smelled like metal and dust, and my own breathing sounded too loud. I reached aisle 17 and shined my light down the long row of shelves. Nothing. Just boxes stacked floor to ceiling. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been here. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it had been a glitch on the camera. Maybe I had imagined it. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard it. A slow creaking noise, like something shifting behind the shelves. I whipped my flashlight back toward the aisle. Nothing moved. The air felt thicker now, like something was pressing against my chest. Then, a box, from the top shelf, slid forward and crashed to the ground. I jumped back, my pulse hammering. I stared at the fallen box, heart pounding. No reason it should have fallen. No wind, no vibration, just gravity. I swallowed hard. Then I heard it. A voice. A whisper. Right behind me. "Why are you here?" I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip. No one. Just shadows stretching between the shelves. The air had turned ice cold. Something was wrong. I turned back toward the aisle and saw the figure, standing at the very end. It was closer now. Too close. And this time, I could see it clearly. Its face was wrong, distorted, like an image stretched too far. Its mouth was too wide, and when it tilted its head again, I heard an awful, wet cracking sound, like something breaking. I didn't wait. I ran. I sprinted back toward the security office, my shoes slamming against the concrete floor. I could hear the shelves creaking behind me, like something was moving through them. Fast. I burst into the office and slammed the door shut. locking it. My hands trembled as I turned to the monitors. Every camera showed the same thing. Rows of shelves. Empty hallways. Nothing. Except for camera 6, where the figure was now standing directly in front of the lens. Its mouth was open, and it was smiling. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I grabbed my bag and ran. By the time I reached the parking lot, my chest was burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped into my car, locked the doors, and sat there, staring at the warehouse. It was just a building. It shouldn't have felt like it was breathing, like something inside was still watching me, waiting. I quit the next morning. I didn't give a reason. I just left, and I never looked back. But sometimes, late at night, when I pass old warehouses, I think about that night, about the figure in aisle 17, and I wonder, if I had stayed longer, would it have let me leave at all? I used to think working the night shift at a convenience store would be easy. Stock the shelves, ring up the occasional customer, watch the clock tick down until morning. I was wrong, because something else watched the clock too, and it was waiting for me. I worked at a small, run-down gas station on the edge of town, the kind of place with flickering neon signs, all full of expired snacks, and a coffee machine that hadn't been cleaned properly in years. It wasn't exactly popular. Most nights, I only got a handful of customers, truckers passing through, drunks stumbling in for cigarettes, the occasional lost traveler. But after 2 a.m., it was just me and them. I first noticed it 2 months into the job. I was stacking candy bars near the front counter when I saw movement in the convex security mirror above me. A shadow darting between the aisles. My breath hitched. I turned fast, expecting to see a customer. But the store was empty. I frowned, rubbing the back of my neck. Maybe I was tired. Maybe the dim lights were playing tricks on me. I shook it off and went back to work. But then, from the other end of the store, I heard it. Soft footsteps. I slowly stood up, my pulse quickening. "Hello?" I called out. "We're closing in a few hours." Silence. The store was still, but the feeling in my chest didn't go away. I grabbed the bat we kept behind the counter and stepped into the aisle. Nothing. Just rows of dusty shelves and the distant hum of the refrigerator units. But I knew in my gut, something had been there. Something had moved. And it would be back. The next few nights, it got worse. I started seeing shadows shifting in the corners of my vision. Objects would move on their own. Not big things, but little ones. A bag of chips that I knew had been on one shelf would suddenly be on another. The bathroom door would creak open, even though I had locked it. And sometimes, when I was standing at the counter, I would feel it. A presence, just behind me. Breathing. Watching. But the worst part? The security cameras never caught anything. One night, around 3 a.m., I had finally had enough. I was restocking the soda fridge when I saw it again, that same shadow, slipping through the aisles. Only this time, I didn't look away. I followed it. I moved slowly, keeping my eyes locked on the far aisle. My footsteps felt too loud against the tile floor. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed, flickering slightly overhead. I turned the corner, stepping into the candy aisle, and saw it. A figure, standing perfectly still at the end of the row. It was tall, its limbs too long, too thin, and it was looking right at me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move. The figure twitched, shifting slightly. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked toward the back of the store, disappearing into the storeroom. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes. Then, finally, my body reacted. I grabbed the radio off my belt and clicked it on. "Hey, James?" I called, my voice shaking. James was the other night shift worker, covering a different location across town. Static. Then, a voice. But it wasn't James. It was a whisper, low and crackling through the speaker. "Why are you following me?" I dropped the radio. The sound echoed in the empty store, making me flinch. My breath came in short gasps as I stepped backward, right into a shelf. A row of candy bars tumbled to the floor, scattering at my feet. And from the back room, I heard the storeroom door creak open. I bolted. I ran straight for the front counter, nearly tripping over my own feet. I slammed my hand against the automatic door button, but nothing. The doors wouldn't open. I grabbed the keys from my pocket, fumbling to unlock them manually. And then I felt it. A presence, standing right behind me. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I turned my head, just slightly, just enough to see. A reflection in the glass doors. Something standing over me, its face just inches from mine. Its mouth was too wide, stretching into a horrible, unnatural smile. I could feel it breathe. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have followed me." The lights flickered violently. The registers shut off. The security monitors glitched out, and for a moment, everything was pitch black. I stumbled forward, grabbing the emergency latch, and ripped the door open. Cold night air hit me like a punch, and I ran. Out into the parking lot, into the safety of the streetlights. I turned, gasping. The store was silent, empty, like nothing had happened. But through the glass doors, deep in the darkened aisles, I swore I saw it. A shadow, standing right where I had been, waiting, watching, for the next person to follow it. I quit the next morning. I didn't explain why. I just left. But sometimes, late at night, when I drive past that gas station, I see it. The flickering open sign, the empty aisles, and in the back, near the storeroom door, a shadow, standing, waiting.